everybody. Welcome to North Shore. It is really good to see you, both those of you who are in this room and those of you who are joining us online. We're so glad that you're here as we kick off summer at North Shore. I'll tell you, our family was out of town for a couple of weeks. We were in central eastern Washington, where it's the land of flowing of milk and honey. It's warm. It was 98 degrees, and we drove back over the pass, and it felt like it was 28 degrees because it's January here in the Puget Sound, but it's still summer at North Shore, and we're so glad that you're here. If it's your first time with us, you picked a great weekend to be here because we're kicking off this new series, this new conversation we want to have called Stuff Jesus Never Said. Because there are a lot of misconceptions in our day about what he said or what he didn't say and what that means. Some of you have probably heard that saying, God helps those who help themselves. Sounds nice, sounds spiritual, maybe sounds biblical, but Jesus never said that. That's not in the Bible. Or how about this one? I've heard this a lot. God won't give you more than you can handle. Maybe you've been in a hard situation or a challenging situation and someone said those words to you because they meant well, they wanted to encourage you, but here's the thing, Jesus never said that. That's not in the Bible. So for the next few weeks, we're gonna look at some of the stuff that Jesus actually said, not just to correct what he didn't say, but to encounter the life-changing power of what he did say. Because when we misunderstand the words of Jesus, we miss out on the power of Jesus. And today, I want to start with some words that Jesus never said to people who make a lot of mistakes, or people who struggle or don't follow the rules, or people who have simply made a mess of their life. Some of you may remember this story. It hit the news some years ago. It was about a 9-year-old boy from Texas who moved with his family to Tacoma, Washington. And this kid was so unhappy, he was so angry about the move that after they moved and kind of settled in, he actually stole a car. He was chased by the police. He wrecked the car, somehow evaded police custody, and made his way to the airport where he snuck on an airplane through security with a discarded boarding pass. Thank you, TSA. He snuck on a flight to San Antonio. He made that flight, and then he was actually apprehended by the police trying to make a connection to Dallas. And then he was placed in juvenile custody in San Antonio, though, as the article noted, to a diehard Texan, that was still better than Tacoma. Now, Texans are just that kind of people, right? There's some applause out there. Now, I don't know too many people who have stolen a car and been chased by the police and then been arrested in another state, all while they were in the 3rd grade. But I know a lot of people who've made some really serious mistakes in their life. I know people who have deep regrets that they carry in their marriage or in their family or in their career. Mistakes that people made with money, or sex outside of marriage, or unfaithfulness in marriage, or a secret habit, or a double life. People who've hurt people they love, or who've broken a commitment to people they care about. People who've embraced a life or a lifestyle that goes against what God has for us. And here's the thing, there's times in my life where that's been me. And maybe that's you, or someone you know, or someone you love. But here's what's so amazing about Jesus. Jesus never said, sorry, you've gone too far. Or sorry, you've sinned too much. Or wow, you really crossed the line. No, I usually forgive people, but I'm not gonna forgive you. You're just kind of annoying. I'm not gonna do that. And maybe you think that's what God said, or maybe you feel like that's what God said, or maybe you've heard that from another person, but Jesus never said that. And to prove it to you, I want to take you back into Scripture, into God's Word, to one of the most well-known stories in the Bible. It's a story that many of you already know, but that all of us need to hear again. So if you have a Bible or a Bible app on your phone, I want you to open it right now to the Gospel according to Luke. This is the account of Jesus' life according to a man named Luke, chapter 15. And here's the thing, we're gonna be in this chapter this week and next week, so you can just bookmark this page because we'll be in this one for a couple of weeks. And here's what's important. For us to understand what Jesus said and what he didn't say, it's helpful and we take some time to actually go back and see and hear these words from a first century perspective. So we're gonna have to travel back in time and do a little work to be able to hear what Jesus actually said and what that actually means. So at times as I walk through this, I may pause and ask you, are you with me? And even if you're not, I want you to emphatically say yes. So are you with me? Yes, here we go. All right, starting Luke 15, starting in verse 1, Luke says this. He writes, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. What a beautiful scene that is. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. So let's set the stage. The story begins not with what Jesus said, but what the religious leaders in his day were saying about him. And it wasn't good. This man, they said, they couldn't even bring themselves to say his name. Did you catch that? They can't even say his name. They're so frustrated. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Now, here's the thing. It's easy, especially if you grew up in church and you know some of the gospel stories, the stories about some of these religious leader types. It's easy to kind of look down on them or dismiss their concerns because they're always grumbling about something. You know how church people can be kind of grumbly? I mean, not us, of course. Other church people can be kind of grumbly, right? We kind of grumbly about stuff. But we need to remember these are well-motivated people. They're sincere and well-motivated people. The teachers of the law were the trained theologians of that day. They were the seminary professors, the ordained pastors, the church elders. And the Pharisees were the lay leaders of that day. They were the life group leaders, the longtime believers, the people who've been serving in that ministry for year after year after year, faithfully, season after season. And here's the thing, both of these groups of people deeply wanted to be right with God. They wanted to be right with God. And here's the thing, they wanted other people to be right with God, which is a really good thing, right? Their problem, as a professor of mine used to say, wasn't their desire to be holy. Their problem was their concept of holiness. For them, holiness amounted to keeping the rules or following the rules or getting things right, so to speak. And the more you followed God's rules, the holier you were. And more importantly, to remain holy, rule keepers had to keep their distance from rule breakers so they wouldn't be corrupted by them. By the way, doesn't this sound familiar? Because a lot of people in our day have this same concept of holiness, a desire to be holy, which is a good thing, but this kind of concept of holiness. So that's why they were just so frustrated with Jesus, because Jesus wasn't keeping that appropriate distance from the rule breakers. In fact, Luke says he was welcoming them. In fact, the word Luke uses for welcoming wasn't the normal Greek word dekamai, which just means to sit down and welcome and talk with a person. He used this unique word, prosdekamai, which means to receive and welcome someone as a true friend, a true friend. So Jesus was welcoming these sinners as friends, and Luke says he was eating with them. Now, why is that such a big deal? I mean, we share meals kind of in a casual way. You might have a meal with someone that's an acquaintance or a colleague. You might even share meals with people you don't really like or at least feel, good about inside. So why is it such a bad thing? Well, in the first century Middle East, sharing a meal was like a sacramental act. To share a meal with someone was a sign of total acceptance. If you had a meal with someone, it was a way of saying you are now a brother or a sister. And if you had an enemy and you wanted to make peace or reconcile with them, you would invite them to a meal, which is why, if you go through the Gospels, Jesus often depicts heaven as what? A great banquet, like a feast, because it's a picture of this reconciliation, this acceptance, this we're now one family, which is why these religious leaders were so outraged with Jesus. Because Jesus wasn't just having conversations with tax collectors and sinners. He wasn't just preaching or sharing the good news or the word with tax collectors and sinners. He was accepting them like they were his family. He was sharing meals with them, not after they cleaned up their act, but before they did, before they even knew that they needed to clean up their act. And for a religious person in that day, this violated their understanding of holiness. They were thinking to themselves, no holy God would do such a thing. Are you with me? With me? Are you with me? Yes. All right, let's keep going. And so Jesus responds by telling 3 stories. The first is about a shepherd and a lost sheep. The second is about a woman and a lost coin. And the third, the story we're going to look at, unpack today, is about a father and a lost son. So if you've ever wondered if you've gone too far or sinned too much, here's some of the stuff that Jesus actually said about that. He began this way. He said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. Now, we need to pause here for a moment because this is a loaded request. It's a loaded statement. In that day, to ask for one's share of the estate wasn't like asking for a loan or to borrow the car keys. For the son to make this request while his father is still living was like saying, Dad, I'm tired of you. I'm tired of being around you. I'm tired of your way of life. I'm tired of who you are. In fact, I'd rather go out and live life on my own terms so much that it would help me if you would just go ahead and die so I can get what's coming to me. In fact, there's a New Testament scholar named Dr. Kenneth Bailey whose work I'm indebted to in this message. And he spent much of his life living in the Middle East. And over the course of his life, he told this story that many of you, that we've all heard before. He told this story to thousands of villagers. And he asked them this kind of set of questions. He said, has anyone ever made such a request in your village in real life? Never, they said. Could anyone ever make such a request? Impossible, they said. If anyone ever did, what would happen? His father would become angry and refuse, they said. Why? Because this request means he wants his father to die. That's how serious this moment is. That's how offensive this moment is. I was thinking about what's a possible kind of comparison or analogy in our day, and I once heard someone say this request would be like a husband telling his wife, I know we've been married for 27 years, but in anticipation of you dying one day, I've already found my next wife and I've invited her to move on in. Which, by the way, is a true story that actually happened in the family of a friend of mine, but that's for another sermon, so we won't talk about that now. This son's request is that offensive. But it's important to notice here, he's not breaking a rule, okay? He's not breaking a rule. In fact, in Deuteronomy 21, we read in Israel's law, the law states, this son is entitled to 1/3 of the family wealth, and it doesn't say he must wait for his father to die. So why is that important? Because the son here in this moment, what makes the son lost, what makes him the prodigal son, isn't first breaking a rule, it's breaking a relationship. Do you see it? It's breaking a relationship, which, by the way, is what sin at its core is actually all about. You see, we get it all wrong when we assume that sin is only about breaking the rules, when at its heart, it's about breaking a relationship with God. It's about saying, God, I'd rather be in charge of my own life. And as we'll see next week, and I hope you come back next week, as we'll see next week, you can keep all the rules and still find yourself deeply, deeply lost. But for the father in this story, in this moment, this request from the younger son isn't just offensive, it's humiliating. In fact, in that culture, the only way he could salvage his honor, because by now the whole village would know, word would be spreading, gossip. Did you hear what the younger son said? Did you hear what he said to his father? I can't wait to see what that father does to that son. Everyone would be waiting. And in that culture, the only way the father could salvage his honor, his reputation, would be to punish the son or to cut him off permanently. In fact, in that day, there was a ceremony called kezezah. Everyone say that out loud. Kezezah. It comes from the Hebrew word for cutting off. And if this father, or if the son was cut off, if he was kezezah by the father and ever tried to return home, the elders of the village, this was the ceremony, the elders of the village would come out and meet him at the city gates, and they would break a clay pot at his feet And they would say, "You have been cut off and you are not welcome here." After which the son would be mocked and scorned and possibly even beaten. So here's the thing. Everyone listening to Jesus tell this story is thinking this son is about to be punished or banished or both. And if he ever returns, guess what? Kezezah will be waiting. Are you with me? You with me? Here we go. But instead of doing either of those things, the father does something totally unexpected. Look at what Jesus said next. So the father divided his property between them, meaning he sold off his assets and his estate. He sold off so much of his assets to be able to give a third of that to his son. Why? Why do this? I mean, by not banishing or punishing his son, he would suffer the loss of his reputation in the village. He would live with public disgrace, which in that culture was way worse than death itself. So why do this? Simple. The father was willing to do anything he could to try to protect and preserve his relationship with his son. Do you see that? He would do anything to preserve his relationship with his son. And by the way, that's why our God is willing to endure our disrespect, our offenses, our disobedience. That's why he simply doesn't punish or banish, because he wants to remain a father. And so he quietly suffers the shame of our choices. But the son in the story, he couldn't see it, at least yet. He couldn't see the character of his father. And after a scandal like this, he would no longer be safe at home. And so Jesus says, not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Now, we're not actually told what the younger son does to waste his money. In fact, a little later in the story, we find out the older brother has a few theories about what he was doing, but we're not told what he did. All we know is he wasted everything. Everything is lost. And then we read that after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. Now, that phrase "in need" means he was unable to find work, which means he had no money, he had no food, he had no place to stay. But here's the thing, he didn't go home. Severe famine, no job, no food, no friends, no place to stay, but he didn't go home. Why? Because he knew what he would face. As soon as he arrived at the city gates, the people in his village would come out and declare him, "Kezezah, you've gone too far, you've sinned too much, you've crossed the line, you are cut off, and you're not welcome here." And then he would be mocked, and he would be ridiculed, and he would be scorned. And by the way, it makes you wonder how many younger sons and daughters out there don't turn back to God, not because of God, but out of fear of what other people might do. And maybe that's your story. Maybe that's the story of someone you know or someone you love. And so the younger son doesn't go back. In fact, his fear of going home is so great, he does something that is unthinkable for a first century Jew in that day. Look at what Jesus says. It says, so he went out and hired himself out to a citizen of that country. That would be a Gentile. He hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. In other words, he threw himself to the mercy of a Gentile who sent him out to feed pigs, probably to get rid of him, because no self-respecting Jew in that day would have done a job like this. And then Jesus said that he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Meaning he becomes such a disgrace. Think about this. He becomes such a disgrace that the people around him were willing to let him starve to death. And that's how bad it got. That's how low he had gone. And now he's got nowhere to turn and nowhere to go. He's lost everything and everyone in his life. So question, have you ever made such a mess of your life that there's nothing that you know to do? There's nowhere safe that you can go. There's no one that you believe you can tell. There was a woman in my last church where I was serving who grew up dreaming about being a famous actress. Big dream for her life. Then in high school, she started drinking and partying, and that evolved to drug abuse and an addiction to alcohol. And eventually, she dropped out of high school, moved around the country trying to get acting jobs, but consistently lost work because of that addiction. And then she resorted to working as a prostitute and living on the streets. Until one night when she found herself balled up in a bathroom stall, nowhere to turn, nowhere to go. She'd lost everything and everyone in her life. She didn't even believe in God, but she found herself in that moment, in that bathroom stall, palled up in a corner cold, mustering the only words she knew to say, which were, God, help me. God, help me. Well, the younger son in the story had a similar kind of thought. Look at verse 17. Jesus says, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. So I will set out and go back to my father. The son comes to his senses. That is, he realizes something that makes him willing to go back and suffer the consequences of his choices. So what does he realize? What comes to his mind? Well, on the one hand, as you can see from that text, he realizes his need. He's starving to death. He realizes he's just desperate. He's lost. He's broken. And by the way, if you ever feel like you're desperate and lost and broken, you've got nothing to bring back to God, nothing to give, you can come home. You can still come home. But there's something more. He goes home, not when he realizes the severity of his need, but when he remembers the goodness of his father. How many of my father's men have food to spare, but I'm here starving to death? Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying, my father is good. My father is loving. My father is generous. And if he treats even hired servants this way, maybe there's a chance for me. And so he says, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. As a former professor of mine once noted, the son plans a 3-part confessional speech. 3 parts. Part 1 is his admission of wrongdoing, his admission of wrong. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. In other words, I was wrong and I know it. That's part 1. Part 2 is his awareness that there are consequences. He says, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. In other words, I realize I didn't just break a rule, I broke my relationship with you. And I'm no longer worthy of being your son. That's part 2. And then part 3 is his request to make up for what he had done wrong. Make me like one of your hired servants, he says, so that I can pay off my debt and make things right. So how many parts? 3 parts. Admission of wrong, awareness of consequences, and then his request to make things right. Are you with me? Because we need to keep this in mind or we're going to miss the whole point of what happens next. So keep these in mind. Back to the story. And so he got up and went to his father. And here's where the story takes the most surprising turn. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, meaning his father had been watching. His father had been waiting, probably every day since he had been gone, every day since he had run away, every day since he had humiliated his dad. His father had been watching. Will this be the day? Will this be the day? Will this be the day that he comes home? He saw him. And by the way, the father sees you. The Father still sees you. No matter how far you have wandered away, the Father still sees. And he was filled with compassion for him, not anger, not resentment, not I told you so, but compassion, love, empathy. And it says, he ran to his son. I love this detail. He ran to his son. A better translation of that verse is he actually raced or sprinted to his son, something that he probably had not done in over 40 years. And not because he was lazy or didn't enjoy, exercise or whatnot. In that culture, adult men did not run. They did not run. Kids run, servants would run, but honorable men would not run, because in order to run, you have to lift up your robe, show off your dad legs and your jean shorts, and get kind of humiliated in public. That's just kind of how it works. So it's kind of a humiliating act in that day. But he's not worried about how he's going to be seen by other people. He is not worried about his reputation at all. He just hikes up that robe and he runs as fast as he can to his son. Why? Because he knows what his son is about to face. When the villagers come out and break that pot at his feet and say, Kezeza, you are cut off. And the father runs, not just out of love, but to make sure he gets there first. And then he threw his arms around him and kissed him. And kissed him. And couldn't stop kissing him. No questions, no critiques, no I told you so, no I knew this would happen, just the loving embrace of a gracious father. And friends, I want to tell you a dynamic that many people miss when we don't see this in the context of which Jesus said it. When he embraced him, when he put his arms around his son in front of all the villagers to see, he literally took on the sin and the shame of his own son onto himself. He took it on himself so that whatever scorn or punishment the villagers would want to give to that son, they must now do to the father. And by the way, the Pharisees and teachers of the law didn't know it yet, but Jesus wasn't just telling a story, you see. Jesus was telling his story. That he is the father who's come out of the house and come running into this world to take on the kezezah, the cutting off that we deserve. You see, this picture is what the cross of Jesus is all about. This is what makes Christianity unlike any other faith or religion in the world. It's not just that sinners can be made holy and righteous. It's how we are made holy and righteous. And isn't it by promising to measure up? It's by receiving the grace and loving embrace of a father who is willing to take our sin upon himself. Have you ever seen love like this before? You have if you know Jesus, because this is his story. But the younger son hadn't. The younger son was probably so overwhelmed at this moment, he didn't know what to do other than just kind of go back to that confessional speech, right? The speech he had planned out, the speech he had worked on in his head. You know, when you go home or you go back to your spouse, you go back to your work, you've planned that speech, right? And you're kind of not sure what to say or how they're going to respond. So all you can do is go back to your script. And so the son goes right back to his script. The son says to the father, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. And notice the father lets him say part one. Because it's important. It's good to be able to admit our wrong and admit that we were wrong. The father lets him say part one, and then he lets him say part two. I am no longer worthy to be called your son, because it is good. It's important for us to recognize the consequences of our sin, the consequences of our choices, the consequences of our actions. We need to realize that. We haven't just broken some abstract rules. We've broken a relationship with the Father. But then here's the most amazing part of the story. As the son kind of ramps up for part three. Remember how many parts of the speech? 3 parts. As the son is ramping up for part 3, before he can say, make me like one of your hired servants, the father interrupts him. The father interrupts him. The father refuses to let his son say, make me a servant. Let me come work for you. Let me pay off my debt and make things right. Why? Because there's no place for paybacks with this kind of father. He's already done the work. He's already paid off the debt. The father interrupts him and says, quick, it's coming. There it is. Quick, bring the best robe and put him on him. Think about that. The son, still in the stench of pig feces and muck and this past life, coming home, and father says, put the best robe on him. And by the way, the best robe is the father's robe. Put the best robe on him. And the father isn't finished. Put a ring on his finger. This would be the signet ring. It's the ring that was used to sign documents and do official business. It was a symbol of authority and control over the state. In other words, the son, get this, the son who had wasted a third of the family fortune was now given control over the affairs of the house. Not after he had paid it back, but while he's in the middle of the street. But the father isn't finished. He says, and put sandals on his feet. See, servants went barefoot. Sons and daughters wear shoes. So the son is even though with his past and all that's behind him, he is restored to being a son in the house without any loss of status, any kind of demotion. But the father still isn't finished. He says, and bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. The fattened calf was reserved for the most honored guest. So Jesus, are you saying this lost son who wasted his life and disrespected his father and offended everybody and deserved none of this is now the guest of honor? Really? And those who were listening had to be thinking, Jesus, this is foolish. It's reckless. It's wrong. Some of you have heard the son called the prodigal son. The son, that word prodigal means reckless or wasteful. This story is not about a prodigal son. It's about a prodigal father who recklessly wastes all these gracious gifts on this son, still standing in his mess in the street. But guess what? The father still is not finished. He has one more word to say, with all the villagers watching, probably in disgust and horror at what they're seeing. He looks into the eyes of his son and says, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. This son of mine, this son of mine, this son of mine. You see, in the father's eyes, this lost son was never a disgrace or a failure or a sinner. You know what he was? He was always his father's son. The son just couldn't see it. And the same is true for you. And the same is true for me. No matter how messy your life is, no matter how far you have fallen short, in God's eyes, you are not a screw-up, you're not an adulterer, you're not a liar, you're not a cheat, you're not an addict. You are a son. You are a daughter of a really good father who is waiting, who is watching, who is patiently waiting for that day that you would come back, and who is willing to come out of his house and love you and embrace you and take your sin and shame upon himself and make things right for you. Even when you think everyone else is going to cast judgment or point the finger, even if you feel like you've been cut off from friends or family or the church, this God is ready to look you in the eye and say, this son of mine or this daughter of mine is finally home. Finally home. You know, that woman from my last church who prayed in that bathroom stall on the floor believed her life was over, and it looked over by any stretch of the imagination. But as soon as she prayed, God help me, God did. In fact, later that same day, she met someone who was in recovery for alcoholism. And he went on to take her to her very first recovery group, where eventually she found Jesus, and she discovered Jesus was nothing like she had thought. She discovered that Jesus loved her and delighted in her and gave his life for her. More importantly, she discovered that no matter what she had done, what was in her past, no matter how messy her life was, she never stopped being her heavenly Father's daughter. She just couldn't see it until this moment. And today she's helping people who've lived through similar experiences come home to the grace of this good Father. And I still remember the day that I met her. The joy in her eyes was hard to describe. The joy of being embraced as a daughter, the joy of being loved unconditionally, the joy of being accepted, not after she made things right, but because God had already made things right on the cross when Jesus took the punishment, the kezezah that we deserved, so that we could be sons and daughters again. Friends, have you ever seen love like this? Which, by the way, this is why all those tax collectors and sinners were gathered around to hear Jesus. Friends, it wasn't because they wanted to be near him. It's because they realized he wanted to be near them. And here's the thing. He wants to be near you. He wants to be with you. No matter how far you've gone or what line you've crossed, maybe you've really messed up your life. Maybe you made some choices that you regret. Maybe you've cheated. Maybe you've been sleeping around or lusting online. Maybe you have choices that, again, are deep regrets for you. Maybe you've been living a double life. Sometimes people who've been going to church for a long time have a secret life or a secret struggle that nobody knows about, and that makes that fear and that shame about being cut off even worse, doesn't it? So here's the good news. It is safe to come home. It's safe to come home. God has already done the work. God has already paid the price in Jesus on the cross. And here's the thing. Nobody earns their way home. They just come home. They have to come to their senses and realize, oh, wait, our Heavenly Father is good and he's generous and he's loving. I just have to come home. And he's waiting for you and he's ready for you. All you have to do is come home and let him embrace you in your mess. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for the son of mine, this daughter of mine, was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. At least that's what Jesus actually said. So I want to give you a moment right now, whatever's going on in your life, I want to give you a moment to take this step with God. So if you would just bow your heads and close your eyes for just a moment. And the same for those of you watching online, just to take a moment, bow your heads, close your eyes, put away the distractions. Some of you may know someone who is far from God, and this is a great moment to pray for them, and I encourage you to do just that. But right now, I'm talking to any of those of you who don't know if you've ever made this step to come home to your Father. And I just want to tell you right now, you can come home. The Father is waiting. The Father is ready. The Father sees you. No matter how many mistakes you've made, no matter how deep the regrets go, no matter what burdens you're carrying, it's safe to come home. All you need to do, like that younger son, are say these simple words to God. Father, I have sinned against you, and I'm no longer worthy of being your son or your daughter. But you don't have to promise to repay or ask to become a servant. You just need to say, I want to receive your forgiveness and invite you into my heart and my life right now, to take the step of just letting God love you and embrace you in your mess. Because that's what Jesus does. And you can just say those words to God right now, knowing you have nothing to fear. He's come out of his house in the person of Jesus to find you and love you and give his life for you and take on your sin and your shame on his life so that you can go free. And if that's your prayer today, Jesus is already here in this room, just waiting to meet you and embrace you and welcome you home into the family. And because this decision changes everything, if this is your prayer, I want to ask you to do something with nobody's eyes are open, nobody's looking. With all the heads still bowed and eyes closed, I want you to take out your phone. Just take it out of your pocket. I want you to open your message app right now. I see some of you doing that right now. And I want you to text the word my faith, one word, MYFAITH, my faith, to 97000. Just do that right now, whether you're in this room or watching online, because this is a significant moment in your life. Changes your eternity. Just text that word right now. I see several phones coming out, and thank you for doing that. It's so good. Jesus, we love you. Thank you for making a way for us to come home. Thank you for never saying you've gone too far, but for coming out of the house, out of your house, out of heaven, into our world to find us and redeem us. Oh, what reckless, foolish, wasteful, beautiful, radical, scandalous love for sinners like me, sinners like us. Help us receive that love now, Jesus, and come home to you. And everybody who agreed with this prayer said, amen.